just a little bit to introduce myself. I've been visiting South Africa for quite regularly with my partner for the past 20 years, 25 years. On the left-hand side is me standing next to Pelargonium xerophytum in South Namibia. This was one of my first trips to South Namibia, and I was amazed at how diverse species in this particular genus are. As many among you, I suppose, I started with cacti and then slowly diversified to other succulents, to growing other succulents, and now grow almost exclusively Pelargoniums and Monsonias, specifically sarcocolons. I've been trying to visit the country almost every year, and specifically visiting in the South African summer because of my job. I work at a university, so I can only travel in July and August, which is not a particularly good time to travel to South Africa because the majority of species in the genus flower in the spring. So ideally, people travel in September to January, with the peak flowering season being October to December. So not being able to find Pelargoniums on the basis of the flowers, I learned how to recognize them on the basis of their leaves, which for me works much better because I can notice many more species, many more taxa in the field, because I see all of them in their growing season, or I could potentially see all of them in the growing season, whereas you can only see a limited number that are in flower during their flowering period, obviously. The genus as a whole is incredibly diverse, as I'm sure is known to many of you. The plants can grow to up to several meters tall. Amongst the tallest succulent species are, for example, Pelargonium paniculatum, very, very frequent in southern Namibia between Aals and the northern Richtersveld. And then there are very, very miniature plants such as Pelargonium trifolium on top right, which grows in the coastal southern Namib desert. The rosettes are extremely small, a few centimeters across, an inch across or so. And these are one of the few species that flower in August, which is when I normally visit that part of the Namib desert. And in the bottom, Pelargonium crassicaule, or some might want to call the taxon on bottom left Pelargonium mirabile or mirandus more properly, and on the top, on the bottom right, Pelargonium cordifolium, one of the typical representatives of the section Pelargonium. These are rather large shrubs that populate the southern tip of the South Africa, which is where you normally get a little bit more rainfall. The species in the Hoarea section inhabit almost the entire northern Cape province and western Cape province, and extend into eastern Cape province as well. I'll talk a little bit about the distribution later, but these are typically areas with rainfall between 100 millimeters per year to quite a lot, actually. The high mountains in the Cederbergs and the mountains around Cape Town receive more than 1,000 millimeters, up to 1,500 millimeters. So quite a lot of rainfall. Of course, most of it falling in the rainy season, which is the winter. What's important with respect to Pelargoniums is to recognize that the flowers are zygomorphic, so they have an axis of symmetry. And I'll talk about petals, two of which are normally posterior petals or upper two petals, and the three anterior petals or lower 3 petals are obviously at the bottom of a flower. What's really important when it comes to pelargoniums is to know that the nectar glands are in a long tube, which can be up to 12 centimeters long, which means that the pollinators need to have proboscis that extend as far as that. So there have been a few recent studies of pollination of Pelargonium species, specifically Hoarea section and other long-tubed sections, because it's been of interest what types of flies, what types of insects visit these flowers and that have such long proboscis. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. In Hoareas, the actual pedicel is usually so short that it cannot be noticed, so maybe half a millimeter. In some taxa, it can get a little bit longer, up to a centimeter or 2, so up to an inch, but this is rather rare. It's rather an exception. In the majority of species, the pedicel is about half a millimeter, so basically cannot be noticed. The rest of what most might consider to be the pedicel is actually the tube that I've been talking about, so the hypanthium. And on in the bottom photo, you can see the end of a hypanthium with a small protrusion, which is where the nectaries are, which is where the nectary glands are. You can see a small droplets with nectar in this cross section. So what's important in terms of taxonomy of the particular section of Hoarea is especially the length of this tube, because many species of insects co-evolved with the taxa in this particular section, so that the length of the proboscis grew alongside the length of the hypanthian tube. And species pairs have developed, so insect and plant, that service one another, so that specific flies will only visit specific types of Hoarea flowers and get them pollinated, of course, and be fed at the same time. What's also important with Hoareas is the number of fertile stamens, or the number of staminodes carrying an anther. This can vary between 5 as the maximum to sometimes only 2. And what's also extremely important is the position of these anthers. And we'll see that in some species, the anthers are positioned such that they brush the pollen off on the belly of the pollinating insect, and some are positioned above over such that the pollen is deposited on the back of an insect. This ensures that there is as little cross-pollination as possible, and of course also helps in keeping populations separate. The majority of Hoareas are very small species. Very typically, the rosettes are somewhere between a centimeter, 2 centimeters across for the smallest species, up to maybe 20, 30 centimeters across for some of the larger species. And what's really important and useful to know, especially in terms of horticulture, is that all of the species in this particular section have tubers. These tubers are so-called moniliform tubers, or tubers that consist of chains of small tubers, small roundish tubers, that form a succulent root system. Very few species have only one central tuber and no side tubers, perhaps I'd say less than 5. The majority of species have quite an extensive side tuber system. It is thought that this helps the plant survive because porcupines and other animals foraging on tuberous roots will be able to find the main tuber, because that's where normally the leaves are, and eat the main tuber, obviously, but the side tubers will sprout into separate plantlets the following year. As a whole, the section is very widespread from southern Namibia, with a few historical herbarium observations extending into the area around Roshpina. So that's the southern tip of Namibia. But the majority of observations, as seen now on iNaturalist, extend from central Richtersveld towards Geberga. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce Port Elizabeth these days, and a few, or rather one species extending into the high mountains of Eastern Cape. This is Pelargonium estivali. There are a couple more species that can be found on the escarpment from approximately Sutherland towards East London. However, these are far and wide. They're really rarely distributed, and there hasn't been a lot of botanizing going on in this area. And my hunch is that if there are many more species to be found, they're probably found somewhere in this region. Pelargonium estivali is really interesting. It's the only species that occupies areas that receive summer rain. The populations of this particular taxon are really, they are numerous, but they are far between. So fairly difficult to find unless in flower. The rest of the species occupy areas that receive winter rain, so Western Cape and Northern Cape provinces, and in the Southern Cape and Eastern Cape, they receive rain year-round. As you can see, the majority of observations are around Cape Town. I mean, obviously, this is a fairly populated area, but this also reflects the density of distribution of the section as a whole. The central, the center of distribution, or the center from which the section radiates out as a whole, is basically the Worcester Basin. So this is a small town next to Cape Town, and this is where the majority of speciation is thought to be ongoing. And many new species have recently been discovered, especially in this area, probably because of one or two really enthusiastic individuals who have been surveying the remaining areas of Renosterveld in the Swartland region and in the Overberg regions. And these surviving areas of Renosterveld are very, very difficult to get to because of the local farmers, and it's right that they are difficult to get to. And they are also very rare. There's just 5% of Overberg Renosterveld remaining, and we have been finding new species in that 5% in the past decade. So it's sad to think how much diversity may have gotten lost in the past 100 years or so. I'll start with the introductions in an area that is very well known to many of you. This is the Knersvlakte in the region between Southern and Northern Cape, surrounding Vredendal and other small towns in the area. It's of course a particularly inhospitable area with very little, particularly winter rainfall, and lots of damage to the veld mainly because of agriculture. There are there is a pair of species which many of you will recognize, I'm sure. But it is it's a pair of taxa that are very often misnamed or erroneously named in collections, and this is because of a historical mix-up. And I'll just talk a little bit about that to start to get us warmed up. This is a typical geophytic species which is found in this area, and many of us would go, oh look, this is a typical Pelargonium karooii henrici, and it can be found both on the right hand side of N7 and on the left hand side of N7, so the Knersvlakte proper. Apologies, the N7 is the main axis, the main highway linking Namibia with Cape Town. So this is a highly protected area, and it's right that it is. It's difficult to get to, but it has been botanized in the past quite extensively. So this particular plant has been known in collections for many, many decades and can be grown relatively easily as long as we know that Hoarea plants require water in the winter and should never really desiccate in the summer, and they typically flower in the spring. In the PhD thesis of probably the most knowledgeable scholar of the Hoarea section, Elizabeth Murray, who did her PhD, who defended her PhD in 1993. She described Pelargonium karooii henrici with this particular illustration, showing a plant which is typically found on the eastern side of the Knersvlakte, so to the right of the N7 driving northwards. These are plants that have absolutely spectacular flowers. Mine have just finished flowering. The staminodes are very beautifully red, tinted red. They only have 2 fertile stamens, and you will see that those stamens are turned upwards. Quite how these plants are pollinated is unclear, because the entry to the hypanthium, so these are hypanthia, these are the long tubes that I talked about. The entry to the hypanthium is behind those 2 stamens. So there must be an insect that can aim into that particular section of the flower and enter the hypanthium with its long proboscis. This particular inflorescence was pictured in Betty's PhD thesis in 1993, and the majority of people, until recently, grew this species as Pelargonium karooii henrici. But those who went to the actual original publication may have noticed that the illustration of the flowers in Nordenstam's 1983 original publication is quite different. We see stamens that are forward-facing, and we see 2 posterior petals with intensive markings, rather than the 3 anterior petals with intensive markings. The rosettes of leaves are almost identical. So pinnate leaves with long bristly hairs, virtually impossible to tell apart. Nordenstam's taxon was found on the western side of Knersvlakte, and Murray's taxon is found on the eastern side of Knersvlakte. So exactly the same rosette, so easy to get mixed up, of course, but the flowers are almost entirely different. So the one on the right-hand side is obviously the true karooii henrici, whereas the one on the right-hand side is an actual undescribed taxon, and is awaiting publication. And obviously a lot of herbarium specimens, herbarium sheets exist, but simply requires to receive a proper scientific name. And that's the flower of the real karooii henrici on the left-hand side, and of the new species or rather the undescribed taxon on the right-hand side. And you see that the flowers are completely different once you see them compared one next to the other. They flower at approximately the same time, the true species slightly later than our new taxon. Another really interesting new taxon has been found in the surroundings of Kamiesberg. So this is now quite a bit north to Knersvlakte. Kamiesberg is in the foothills of the Kamiesberg Mountains. Phenomenally beautiful granite dome mountains, fairly little explored in terms of Pelargonium species. Probably also because many of the areas are still quite difficult to get to. The species that I'm going to talk about was actually discovered around 2000, 2005, well, earlier than that, by Charles Craig. Some of you may remember the name. He was a plantsman and worked with John Labranos on the Sarcocaulon section of the genus Mansonia and produced a couple of absolutely spectacular monographs. And was also an intrepid explorer. So he found a number of species which remain undescribed today. And this one from around Kamiesberg is one of them. It grows in areas of the succulent field that are described as Huvelkis. Huvelkis are thought to be ancient ant mounds that must have been enormous, because the Huvelkis now are little small hills and that's all that remains of those ant grounds. At least that's the hypothesis. From above, these mounds can be seen as formations of slightly denser shrubs, slightly denser vegetation that are typically about 20 to 30 meters across. And within those Huvelkis, you get some really interesting plants. And our Pelargonium is one of those. It can be found on the borders of those Huvelkis, where the shrubs are rarer, but still provide a little bit of protection. This is an absolutely extraordinary plant because obviously the majority of the plant is underground, but where the main tuber is in the center of the photograph. So this is where this little very small leaf is. The rest of the leaves have petioles that are mostly underground and emerge quite a bit away, quite far away from the center, approximately 10 centimeters or even more from the center. So as a rosette, this is one of the bigger rosettes, so maybe 20 or even 30 centimeters across. To many people, or to an untrained eye, this might look like a group of oxalis plants, but it's evidently a Pelargonium. This was discovered by Craig at some point around year 2000 because it was offered in his plant list in 2004, but it hasn't been named yet. I've discussed this species with botanists in Stellenbosch. They know of it, but no herbarium specimens yet exist. I've actually deposited a herbarium specimen in Stellenbosch, but it was lost. So a new one needs to be produced in order to get this described. It flowers beautifully. It has really large flowers for the genus, very nicely marked, and it obviously flowers when the leaves wither. It's interesting to hypothesize what this particular species might be most related to. The stamens protrude through the flower forward. They're not too long, but they can be seen. as opposed to many species in this section where the stamens are very, very short, and sometimes pollinating by hand is a little bit tricky. But these staminodes are quite long. The petals are huge, cordate as well. So the species that these flowers most remind me of is a species that occurs a little bit further down, a little bit to the south, and that's Pelargonium nephrophyllum. This was described not that recently, but it's one of the newer descriptions. You will see the resemblance in the flower shape. But also the rosettes are similar. These Pelargonium nephrophyllum also has rosettes with petioles that extend horizontally from the tuber below ground and then emerge a little bit further away from the center of the plant. So there are quite a few traits, quite a few characteristics of these two taxa that are similar, to my mind at least. Okay, staying close to Kamiesberg, we're now moving a little bit towards the east into the mountains themselves, which is where there have been a few interesting finds recently. Pelargonium pubipetalum, hirtipetalum as well, for example, but these are already known, have been described, have been published, so I won't talk about them. But very recently, a small population of plants was brought to the attention of Florent Grenier, whom many of you might know. He's been doing pollination studies in South Africa for a long while, and in 2019, I had the pleasure of traveling with him from Springbok to almost Cape Town for about a month. So we explored many of the areas that I'll be talking about today. This is a really interesting population, which could be a new taxon, but it is also quite similar to Pelargonium bubonifolium, and I'll show a few photographs later, which also has quite sharply reflexed posterior petals, very long exerted stamens, but of course doesn't have these very hairy leaves. So it is possible that this is a new taxon altogether, although separating this from what could be considered as typical Pelargonium bubonifolium would be a little bit difficult. You can see that the flowers are very similar. Both types of flowers have markings on the posterior petals and reflexed posterior petals as well. Of course, the leaves are very different. Pelargonium bubonifolium leaves are much, much less hairy and quite a bit bigger than this find from the central Kamiesbergs. This is us exploring the mountains surrounding Springbok. Florent Grenier in the center. This is Andre, who found or who caught the first fly of the day. And it turned out that this was a new Prosica fly, typical of this northern Namaqualand region. And this is another biologist, pollination biologist from Pietermaritzburg in southern Africa, Timo van der Niet, who I think in 2020 actually published this new species of flies, which pollinate our geophytic pelargoniums as well. So that's their publication of the new Prosica fly. Another group of taxa, or maybe a very diverse taxon, is Pelargonium pilosillifolium. This extends from Calvinia in the north to the Piketbergs to the Piketberg Massif in the south, further south into the Overberg and quite a bit inland. So it occupies a fairly large distribution area. And although most of these plants have almost identical flowers, their leaves are very, very different. The northern population around in the central Kamiesbergs has very small leaves, and when we first noticed these rosettes, we thought that this could be a carrot plant or something, or a carrot family plant, but it actually turned out to be a geophytic pelargonium. The typical Pelargonium pilosillifolium has leaves as are those in the central photograph. These are enormous plants. This is an enormous plant from the surroundings of Calvinia. I'm hoping that the names of places are not revealing enough for anyone to go and try and find these populations. Calvinia is obviously a very large area, and these plants are huge, and they grow amongst boulders. In the foothills of the Picketberg, we find Pelargonium pilosillifolium with very long petioles and extremely finely divided leaves. And these are typical for the Cederbergs and the Picketberg ranges. Very, very interesting plants, and no one, I suppose, would think that these three leaf shapes could be representative of the same species. And yet the flowers are identical, almost horizontal hypanthea, not long, 2 centimeters plus minus, 5 petals, of course, very similarly shaped and very strongly marked, with just the borders being either cream, yellow, or white. Very short stamens as well, so this would require a pollinator to really insert itself with head first into the flower. Looking at the distribution of this taxon as a whole, there's obviously observations missing in the Kamiesbergs because we've only really found populations in the central Kamiesberg in the last 5 years or so. So these are the plants on the left-hand side photographed. The majority of the rest of the distribution has entire leaves, sometimes waxy, but often with ciliate leaf margins. The western populations, so the Picketbergs and the western Cederbergs, have leaves with that are finely divided. So these three populations are quite separate. Of course, not entirely separate, except for the Kamiesberg population. So we could see some separation in the future into subspecific taxa. Another taxon which is very difficult for the taxonomists is Pelargonium proliferum, simply because along with about 10 or 15 other species, its leaves can range from entire to finely divided. So in the past, this has agonized many taxonomists, and many species were described. This is probably one of the taxa with most synonyms in the section. Today, we think that there is what could be called a typical Pelargonium proliferum in the southern Cederbergs, in areas north of Tulbach, for example. But there are localized populations of plants which we think could be different taxa. A typical Pelargonium proliferum leaf would look like this, so short hairs, either entire laminas or highly divided laminas, but basically highly diverse in terms of shape. The typical flowers have short hypanthea, approximately 15 millimeters or less, and fairly small, fairly short petals as well, typically 15 millimeters and less. There are, however, really interesting populations which on INET and elsewhere are still called Pelargonium proliferum, but we know they're not. We know they are new taxa. I mean, new. They haven't been properly scientifically described yet. one of those was pointed out to me by Rian van der Waalt, a very good friend of mine, the son of the famous Adrian van der Waalt, who described most of the, who wrote the 3 monographs on the genus, and obviously did a lot of work in the 70s and 80s. Rian, his son, is a conservation biologist and a Pelargonium enthusiast. So that's excellent news for us, because he also has access to patches of Renosterfeld around Cape Town that are inaccessible to most of us. This is one of those patches at the foothills of the tall mountains just above Swartland. This is what would be typically called alluvial Renosterfeld. And it is also seasonally quite moist, quite wet, and of course explodes into a riot of flowers in the spring. This is where a really interesting plant population was found, which actually turns out not to be that rare in the Swartland, so the area just surrounding Cape Town, or a little bit to the north of Cape Town. Extremely agriculturally developed area, so that's why very few patches of Renosterfeld remain. But we see immediately that this is not our typical proliferum, because the leaves are basically hairless. They are shiny and also quite succulent. And on closer inspection, we can also see that the petioles of these leaves are of the type which we've already discussed today. So they start growing horizontally and then emerge vertically at some distance from the central tuber. The flowers, however, are very similar to Pelargonium proliferum, so 3 short petals and short hypanthia. The last bit of difference between this particular taxon and proliferum proper is that this particular taxon flowers extremely late. So in the greenhouse, typically September. So this would be March or April in the field, which is much, much later than Pelargonium proliferum, which typically flowers in the late spring. Excuse me. On INAT, Pelargonium proliferum has a very interesting distribution and extends from the central Cederbergs, the Swartland. So these are our observations. This is the taxon towards the Overberg, and that's where another species, another taxon, which should be described as a new species, has been located. So Pelargonium proliferum is likely going to be split into several new species because of the differences in flowering times, of the differences in indumentum, in the way that the leaves grow, etc., etc. But those have never been systematically studied so far. So these differences are slowly emerging as we see observations of these plants emerging on INET as well. So a lot of the field exploration these days is being done by enthusiasts. The Overberg populations are as rare as those in the Swartland. As I mentioned, there's just about 5% of indigenous flora still remaining in this region, because it's again incredibly developed agriculturally. But those areas of Renosterfeld that remain are enormously interesting. This is where extremely rare Hoareas have been described from, such as Pelargonium weberi, of which we only know 2 or 3 populations, and most of those populations are extremely small, so less than 15 plants. There is a small species which resembles Pelargonium proliferum that grows here, and you will see the differences with the Pelargonium proliferum proper almost immediately. In the top photograph, you see the leaves. The leaves are extremely small. The leaves are maybe 2 centimeters long, as opposed to 10, 15 centimeters of length with the proper Pelargonium proliferum. And the other really interesting difference is that these leaves have patent hairs that are not glandular, so they do not secrete any essential oils, and this is not what we would typically see on a leaf of Pelargonium proliferum. The flowers are not big, they are small, but you also see that the shapes of the petals are very different. These are not linear petals that we would typically see in Pelargonium proliferum. These are much, much different in size. These also flower quite late in collections, a little bit later than proliferum from the Cederbergs. So this is very likely going to be described as a new taxon or as a separate taxon. Obviously not new, because people have known about it for a very long time. Another taxon comes from the center of biodiversity of the section, so very close to Worcester. This is a hill close to Worcester, and on top of that hill, a Pelargonium that resembled a very widespread Hoarea, Pelargonium rapaceum, was found approximately 10 years ago, and it's still being studied because it does resemble Pelargonium rapaceum quite a bit, but in some key characteristics, it's also very, very different. These are the leaves, and these two populations grow side by side, so they occupy basically the same area. On the left-hand side, our new taxon, and on the right-hand side, the typical Pelargonium rapaceum. You see that the pinnae in the new taxon are quite a bit broader than the typical Pelargonium rapaceum that grows on the same hill, basically, and that the petioles are quite a bit hairier as well. The problem is that the structure of the hairs in Pelargonium rapaceum differs quite a bit, because Pelargonium rapaceum has one of the most widespread distributions of all species in this particular section, from the Richtersveld in the north to the Overberg in the south, and it extends quite a bit across Klein Karoo and quite a bit towards Eastern Cape as well. And it's only natural that across this wide distribution area, it also exhibits a wide range of properties. So not all leaves of Pelargonium rapaceum are this finely pinnate. So separating these two taxa is going to be a little bit tricky. The flowers, however, are very different to Pelargonium rapaceum. Those of you who grow this species or know it well will know that the three anterior petals form a shape that looks like a pea flower, but not so in this particular taxon, because the three anterior petals are separated, and they allow free access to the 5 fertile stamens. We know this taxon from 2 populations now. A colleague from Cape Town, who's a conservation biologist as well, recently found this taxon close to Somerset West, and sent me a photograph of a very, very small population in practically a public area, so a public park. Just 3 or 4 plants, so extremely small population and extremely endangered. It is absolutely essential that taxa such as this get published, get named as quickly as possible, such that then they can be also properly protected, because you can't protect a plant if you can't name it. So the problem, however, with this particular taxon is that it is so similar to Pelargonium rapaceum that it has been a little bit difficult to derive the diagnosis, so the species description, basically. Another really interesting group of plants is the group of trifolium, Pelargonium trifolium plants. This also extends from Nieuwoudtville in the north, so the Bokkeveld escarpment, through the Koude Bokkeveld, so the cold Bokkeveld basically, and also inhabits areas of the high cederbergs, so the tall peaks of the cederbergs. On the left-hand side, what we might typically consider to be Pelargonium trifolium growing on the Bokkeveld escarpment. They're large leaves, 5-7 centimeters, typically entire to tri-lobate or 5-lobate leaves. In the Koude Bokkeveld, which is a large area, there's a population which is fairly localized with finely divided leaves. And this is being attempted to be described as a new taxon by Dr. Marais, but the publication unfortunately hasn't been accepted yet. And on the right-hand side, a miniature version of what we currently still consider Pelargonium trifolium from the high cederbergs. The rosettes of this miniature species are maybe 2 centimeters across or so, so they are really, really tiny and do not compare very easily with the large species, with the typically large populations, the typically large-leaved populations around Nieuwoudtville. But the flowers of these three are almost identical again, so it's going to be difficult to separate these one from another. The middle one, so the Koude Bokkeveld one, is probably it's probably going to receive a different name to Pelargonium trifolium, of course. This is the distribution of this group of species as a whole. So our typical Pelargonium trifolium species in the north, the cederberg populations and the Koude Bokkeveld populations in the center, and a very interesting recent observation close to Villiersdorp. These are the flowers, very similar, always pink, of different shades, long exerted stamens. And what's really interesting is that the posterior petals in all of these species have ears, such that the bases of petals form canals. And those canals form an opening through which the pollinator needs to penetrate into the hypanthium. This is unique for these three taxa, or unique for this group of taxa, and hasn't been noticed in any other Hoarea species or other Pelargoniums as a whole. You can see how these ears are shaped in some of these not very good photographs, I'm sorry to say. The flowers of our mountainous population are extremely small, typically 1 centimeter across. So these are the ones on the right-hand side, whether the flowers of Pelargonium trifolium proper are quite big, 2 centimeters across and more. Another species Derek will know really well, because he found the population close to Robertson in what would typically be called Robertson karoo. This is where we were looking for the species with Betty Marais on the left-hand side and the farmer on the right-hand side, who kindly showed us around. And this is a really interesting taxon. It's absolutely beautiful because the rosettes of leaves are very small, no bigger than a daisy. And the flowers are quite special because this is one of the 3 or so types of flowers where the anthers are oriented such that they deposit pollen on the back of the pollinating insect. You see that the fertile stamens are typically 2, but there are flowers with 4 fertile stamens, so there are 1 or 2 lateral fertile stamens as well. This is a completely unique arrangement of fertile stamens, and this particular taxon still hasn't been described. It was, I believe, originally found by Charles Crape because he described it in his book, which was published in 2001. And he offered it through his plant list as Pelargonium species nova, Robertson karoo. So it's been grown in collections for quite a few decades. An absolute delight and a total oddity in the section. Many species take a really long time to describe because they need to be studied both in the winter when the leaves are green and then in the spring or summer when they flower. Many species basically share the typical leaf type, the proliferum leaf type, which is pinnate, entire to pinnate. So many botanists disregard these plants in the field because they don't look particular, and many species flower with very similar flower types. So unless you can compare the leaf shape with the flower type, it is very often the case that you don't notice that you're dealing with something new. That's why it is essential that Pelargonium populations, or specifically this section, are visited several times a year so that we can notice the leaves, we see the peculiarities of the flowers, and then it emerges whether or not we're actually dealing with a new taxon. So a taxon which I pointed out to Dr. Mare in 2003, growing in a very peculiar habitat, what could be called the remnants of Afromontane forest at the edges of the Bockefeld escarpment, was brought to her attention in 2003. I then produced the herbarium sheet with which happily didn't get lost, and she described it only in 2021, so 2 years ago, as Pelargonium roseopetalum. Another miniature species with rosettes, again 2-3 centimeters across, and the flowers are quite peculiar because the posterior 2 petals are extremely narrow and the staminals are intensively red colored. This is a slide that I want to use to introduce Rian van der Waal, standing on the left. This is the 3 of us in the Elandskloof Reserve, with the conservation manager as well. We were looking for Pelargonium elandspontanum, which, by the way, we now know doesn't exist, doesn't grow in one single population anymore, because we found several more populations also outside the reserve. And this is me after 2 hours of 2 months of traveling across South Africa, so not looking particularly civilized anymore. Just a short introduction to the International Geraniaceae group if you're interested in growing these plants, and specifically if you're interested in seeds and in exchange of those seeds. We have a fairly extensive reference collection of Pelargoniums. As the chair of the society, I get sent seeds from many South Africans because they're interested in identification, or and therefore now we grow a collection which is probably about 500 or 600 strong, so different populations, very often different populations of the same taxon, so that we can compare and contrast similarities and characters as well. So it's of interest to many botanical gardens too. And finally, just a quick introduction to the website that I've been developing and that hopefully can be used as a field guide as well, with more than 2/3 of species now described with photographs, etc., etc. So hopefully useful as well. And this is Rian and myself visiting the only remaining population of Pelargonium heterophyllum, which is another small patch of Renosterfeld in the sea of wheat of Swartland. Thank you very much for your attention.